Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. The mirror didn't flatter her. It never did. Not under that bathroom light, not this late, not after a day that had already taken too much out of her. Madison leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the edge of the sink, and stared at her own face like it belonged to someone she was still trying to understand. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes even small sounds feel loud. The faucet dripped once after she turned it off. Somewhere in the building, a distant door closed. The fan above her hummed softly, pulling warm air upward. Madison had spent most of the day looking at versions of herself. The version she posted. The version she replied with. The version she performed in short clips and captions, smiling at the right moments, sounding confident at the right times. She was good at it. She'd learned how to be on without it looking like effort. But now, alone in the bathroom, she felt like a phone with too many tabs open, bright heated, still running even after the work was over. She reached for a makeup wipe, dragged it across her cheek, and watched the cotton come away, slightly tinted. She did it again, slower this time. There was something calming about the motion. Simple, quiet, no audience. In the mirror, her eyes looked tired. Not just sleepy tired in the way someone gets when they've been holding themselves together all day. She tried to smile just to see. It looked strange, like a gesture borrowed from another room. She let it drop. Madison wasn't having a crisis. Nothing dramatic had happened. No breakup, no scandal, no big failure. It was smaller than that, and somehow harder to name. It was the feeling that her worth lived outside of her. In reactions, in numbers, in who noticed, in whether she was wanted, admired, approved of. And when the noise stopped, she wasn't always sure what was left. She turned the faucet on again, letting water run over her hands. The sound filled the bathroom with a steady hush. She splashed her face, then patted it dry with a towel that smelled faintly like laundry soap. Her phone buzzed from the counter, a notification. She didn't pick it up. Just let it sit there, lighting up the edge of the sink and then going dark again. For a moment, she watched herself breathe. It was such an ordinary thing to notice, but it made her feel strangely human. Not a brand, not a profile, just a person with lungs and skin and a nervous system that didn't care how many likes she got that day. Madison leaned closer to the mirror, studying a small line near her mouth she hadn't noticed a year ago. It wasn't deep, it wasn't alarming, but it made her think about time and how quietly it moves through you. A memory drifted in something her grandmother used to say when Madison was little, when she'd run to her crying over a scraped knee or a bad day at school. "Smile at yourself first," her grandmother would say, gentle but certain. "Don't wait for the world to decide if you're worth being kind to." Madison had rolled her eyes back then. It sounded like something from a greeting card. But standing here now, it didn't feel cheesy. It felt practical, like advice for surviving in a world that trains you to outsource your self-worth. She set the towel down and stared at her reflection again this time, without scanning for flaws. She tried to look at herself the way she might look at a friend who'd had a long day. The way you look at someone you don't need to critique, someone you just want to understand. Her shoulders dropped slightly. It wasn't magical. It didn't fix anything. But it shifted something like moving a lamp so the harsh shadow softens. Madison placed one hand on the edge of the sink, grounding herself, and let the other rest on her own collarbone for just a second. The warmth of her skin under her palm felt real, immediate. Not a thought, not a story, just contact. She breathed in, then out, not as a technique, just as a permission. The phone buzzed again faintly. She ignored it again. The world could wait 2 minutes. The world could wait 10. She looked at her own eyes in the mirror. Not the whole face, not the whole image, just the eyes. They were still her eyes, even after everything. Even after the long day, the constant output, the constant comparison. Something in them was still steady. She didn't smile yet, not fully, but she softened her mouth just a little, like she was letting go of a habit she didn't need to keep holding. And in that small softening, she noticed a quiet truth. It wasn't that she needed more validation. It was that she needed to stop treating herself like someone who had to earn kindness. Madison turned off the bathroom light and left the door slightly open as she walked toward her bedroom. The hallway was dim, calm, the kind of dim that tells your brain it's safe to slow down. Behind her, the mirror stayed where it was reflecting an empty bathroom. It wasn't waiting to judge her. It wasn't asking for anything. It was just there. And for the first time all day, that felt like a relief. Madison lay back on her bed without turning on the lamp. The room was lit only by the soft glow from the streetlight outside filtered through the curtains. It wasn't dark enough to disappear into, but it was dark enough to stop inspecting everything. She rested one hand on her stomach, feeling it rise and fall. The other hand lay open beside her palm, up, fingers loose. Her body seemed to understand before her thoughts did that nothing more was required of her tonight. The day replayed itself in fragments. A comment she'd reread too many times. A moment where she'd wondered if she should have said something differently. A brief spike of relief when a post did well, followed by the quiet drop afterward. None of it arrived with the same sharpness it had earlier. It came through a layer of distance now, as if softened by the dim light. She thought again of the mirror. Not the image exactly, but the feeling of standing there without trying to fix anything. Without adjusting angles. Without searching for reassurance or bracing for disappointment. Just meeting herself as she was. That felt new. Madison realized how rarely she did that. How often she approached herself like a problem to solve a version, to improve a thing, to optimize. Even rest had become something she tried to do well, something to succeed at. But lying here with the room quiet and her phone face down on the nightstand, she felt no pull to perform. No need to curate. No one to convince. The thought came gently without insistence. I'm already here. She remembered how easy it had been earlier to place her hand on her own chest. How grounding it felt to feel warmth instead of judgment. It hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't changed her life. But it had changed the tone of the moment. Sometimes healing wasn't about breakthroughs. Sometimes it was about not adding another layer of pressure. Madison rolled slightly onto her side, tucking her knees in just enough to be comfortable. The sheets were cool. The pillow held the familiar shape of her head. Her breathing slowed, not because she told it to, but because there was space for it to do so. She thought about how long she'd been waiting for permission to feel okay. Waiting for the right response, the right reaction, the right signal from outside herself. As if peace were something that had to be handed to her by someone else. But nothing had stopped her from offering it to herself. The mirror hadn't demanded anything. It hadn't praised or criticized. It had simply reflected what was there. And what was there beneath the layers of effort and expectation was someone who was tired but still whole. Someone who didn't need to earn rest. Someone who didn't need to be impressive in order to be worthy of care. Madison felt her jaw unclench slightly. Her shoulders sank into the mattress. A small exhale left her longer than the ones before. There was no urgency to fall asleep, no goal to reach. If sleep came, it would come. If it didn't, this quiet was still enough. She imagined the mirror again now, empty, the bathroom light off. Nothing staring back. Nothing asking her to be different. Just a room at rest. Her thoughts began to drift, not in a scattered way, but in the slow, wandering way that comes before sleep. Images blurred together. The sharp edges of the day softened. Madison didn't think about tomorrow. She didn't plan. She didn't rehearse. She stayed with what was simple and present: breath, warmth, stillness. If she smiled now, it wasn't for the mirror. It wasn't for anyone at all. It was the kind of smile that happens when you stop resisting yourself. Small, private, almost imperceptible. She let it fade naturally. In the quiet, there was nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing missing. Just a person resting inside her own life. And that was enough for the night. The box was heavier than Jason expected. It scraped softly against the wood floor as he pulled it out from under the bed, inch by inch, like it had been hiding down there on purpose. A thin layer of dust coated the top. He ran his finger across it and left a clean line through the gray. Jason sat back on his heels and stared at the box for a moment, as if waiting for it to explain itself. He hadn't planned to do this tonight. He'd only meant to straighten up his room, fold a couple shirts, stack some papers, clear the chair that had become a second closet. It was late and he'd been feeling restless in that familiar way. The way you feel when you've spent too much time in your own head and not enough time in your own life. He was home for a few days between semesters, staying in his childhood bedroom. The room looked almost the same as it always had, just slightly emptier now. Fewer posters, less clutter, a different kind of silence. In the living room, the TV had been on. Earlier, some show his mom liked to watch while she folded laundry. Now the house had settled. The air conditioner clicked on and off. The hallway light cast a soft line under his door. Jason lifted the lid of the box. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. An old baseball glove flattened and dry, a stack of birthday cards with childish handwriting, a small notebook with a cracked spiral, a cheap plastic keychain shaped like a dinosaur. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. The plastic was scratched, the colors faded. For a moment he felt something in his chest, small and sudden, like a door opening briefly into a room he'd forgotten existed. He set the keychain down and pulled out the notebook. It was full of drawings, superheroes, made-up creatures, messy maps of imaginary worlds. He flipped through the pages slowly, not laughing, not cringing, just watching. The kid who made these drawings hadn't been worried about being impressive. He'd been worried about whether the next page had enough space. Jason closed the notebook and leaned back against the bed frame. He'd been telling himself lately that he needed to get his life together, that he needed to move faster, aim higher, figure it out sooner. He'd been scrolling through other people's lives like they were instruction manuals, comparing timelines, comparing accomplishments, comparing confidence. And every time he tried to catch up to that imagined standard, something in him felt more tired, not more alive. Tonight, the box under the bed wasn't offering him a plan. It was offering him a memory of being okay without one. He reached in again and found a small trophy, the kind kids get just for participating. It wasn't shiny anymore. The gold paint had dulled. The plastic base was chipped. The little figure on top looked almost comical. Jason smiled despite himself. He remembered holding it with both hands, walking out of the gym like he'd won something huge. He remembered his dad clapping his mom, taking a picture. The trophy hadn't been proof that he was the best. It had been proof that he'd shown up. And somehow back then, that had been enough. Jason set the trophy on the floor beside him. He looked around the room, the familiar dresser, the old desk with a few new scratches, the closet door that didn't close all the way unless you lifted it slightly. Everything looked ordinary, Nothing about it screamed treasure. And yet, sitting here surrounded by these small pieces of his own history, he felt a warmth he hadn't felt in a while. Not excitement, not motivation, just a quiet sense of being held by something simple. He realized how often he'd been searching for happiness like it was somewhere else, somewhere farther, somewhere bigger, somewhere that would finally make him feel certain, like happiness was a destination and his current life was just the waiting room. But the kid who had lived in this room hadn't been waiting for his life to begin. He'd been living it. Jason picked up one more item from the box, a folded piece of paper creased many times. He opened it carefully. It was a list written in pencil titled, "Things I Like." Underneath were simple entries: pizza, drawing, rain, being home when it's dark outside, mom's hot chocolate, when dad tells jokes. Jason read the list twice. The words weren't deep. They weren't wise. They weren't trying to sound like anything. They were honest. He felt his throat tighten slightly, not with sadness exactly, but with recognition. There had been a time when joy didn't require permission, when liking something didn't have to be justified, when being alive in a small moment was enough. Jason folded the paper back up and held it in his hand for a long second. Outside his room, the house stayed quiet. The air conditioner hummed. Somewhere, the refrigerator made a soft clicking sound. He slid the box a little closer, as if wanting it nearby. Not because he needed to go backward, but because he needed to remember what he'd been running past. Jason didn't rush to put anything back. He sat there on the floor a while longer, the box open beside him, the small pile of objects spread out like a quiet map of where he'd been. None of it felt heavy now. None of it asked him to go back or become someone he no longer was. It just existed calmly, without expectation. He leaned his back against the bed and let his legs stretch out in front of him. The carpet felt familiar under his palms, worn thinner in the spots where he'd once sat to do homework or build something out of nothing. The room held his weight easily, like it remembered how. Jason thought about how often he'd been chasing a feeling of arrival. The idea that one day he'd wake up and everything would click. That he'd feel confident, complete certain. That happiness would finally feel stable, earned permanent. It was a tempting story, a motivating one. But sitting here now, it felt slightly off, like a direction sign that kept pointing farther away from where he already was. The box hadn't given him answers. It hadn't offered a future. It had simply reminded him that contentment had once lived in ordinary things. And maybe it still did. Jason gathered the items slowly, not in a hurry. He stacked the notebook, the cards, the small trophy, the keychain. Each thing returned to the box without ceremony. When he reached the folded list, he paused again. Being home when it's dark outside. He looked around the room, lit only by the lamp on his desk. The rest of the house was quiet, safe. Nothing demanded his attention. For the first time in days, his mind wasn't racing ahead to the next requirement. He was home. It was dark outside. And somehow, that was enough. Jason placed the paper back into the box and closed the lid. He didn't slide it all the way under the bed this time. He left it halfway out like a reminder that it was there if he ever needed it again. He stood, stretched his arms overhead, and felt his back release slightly. The familiar stiffness eased. His body, like the room, seemed relieved to stop being measured against anything else. Jason changed into an old t-shirt and lay down on the bed. The mattress felt softer than he remembered. Or maybe he was just more willing to let himself sink into it. He stared up at the ceiling for a moment, watching the faint shadows shift as a car passed outside. His thoughts drifted not in a searching way, but in a slow, wandering one. He thought about how often people miss their own lives while trying to upgrade them. How easy it was to overlook what was already holding you quietly every day. The treasure under the bed hadn't been about the past. It had been about presence. Jason rolled onto his side, tucking the blanket around himself. The house made its usual nighttime sounds. Pipes settling. A floorboard shifting somewhere. Familiar noises that didn't need interpretation. He felt his breathing slow. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders softened into the mattress. If happiness was a place, it didn't seem far away anymore. It seemed close, almost obvious, like something that had been there the whole time, waiting patiently while he looked elsewhere. Jason didn't label the feeling. He didn't try to hold on to it. He let it be what it was, quiet, gentle, complete enough. The box stayed where it was, half hidden, half seen. The room stayed ordinary, and Jason rested inside it, not searching, not striving, just here. And for tonight, that was all that was needed. The hotel room was quiet in the way only temporary places are. Not the quiet of home, but the kind that doesn't know you yet. The air conditioner hummed steadily. A thin line of light slipped in through the edge of the curtains from the parking lot outside. Ava lay on the bed with her shoes already kicked off, suitcase still closed near the door, as if she hadn't decided whether to stay or leave. She was supposed to be resting. That's what layovers were for. That's what people said. But rest didn't always arrive just because the body stopped moving. Sometimes the mind kept pacing, flipping through unfinished thoughts, the way fingers flip through songs that never quite land on the right one. Ava reached for her phone, then stopped. She set it face down on the nightstand and stared up at the ceiling instead. The faint texture of the paint caught the light differently in each corner, uneven, imperfect. She followed it with her eyes until her thoughts slowed just enough to notice her own breathing again. She thought about how often her life felt like this room. Useful, functional, in motion, but somehow paused. At 29, Ava had learned how to pack light. She knew how to walk quickly through airports, how to smile without overthinking, how to adjust to time zones and expectations. She was good at moving forward. What she wasn't good at was knowing when she had arrived. Lately, a quiet unease had been following her. Not panic, not despair, just a low hum beneath everything, like a melody waiting for its next note. Is this it, or am I still warming up? She rolled onto her side and reached into her carry-on, pulling out a small notebook she kept tucked in the front pocket. It wasn't a journal exactly, more like a place for fragments, lines she liked, half-formed thoughts, things she didn't want to forget, but didn't yet know how to finish. She flipped it open. Most of the pages were unfinished. Sentences that stopped mid-thought. Lists without conclusions. Ideas circled once, then left alone. Ava traced one line with her finger. It had been written months ago during another night in another city. I think I'm waiting for the part where it all makes sense. She smiled faintly and closed the notebook. Growing up, she'd believed life would have clear movements, verses, choruses, a bridge that explained everything before the ending arrived. She'd imagined she'd know when she reached the real part, the part that would confirm she was on the right track. But nothing had announced itself. Instead, life had unfolded quietly. Job offers that felt both exciting and uncertain. Relationships that ended not with explosions, but with gentle drifting apart. Choices that seemed reasonable at the time, then ambiguous later. Nothing had gone wrong, and yet something felt unfinished. Ava sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The carpet was soft under her feet, patterned in a way she would never remember tomorrow. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just a little. Outside the parking lot, lights cast pale circles on the pavement. A few cars sat still, engines ticking faintly as they cooled. Somewhere in the distance, a truck passed on the highway, its sound rising and falling like a breath. She thought about how songs worked. How the first verse often didn't explain much. How melodies repeated before they resolved. How some of the most meaningful parts were transitions, places where nothing seemed to happen, but everything was quietly shifting. Maybe life was more like that than she'd expected. Maybe it wasn't meant to be judged mid-song. Ava rested her forehead lightly against the cool glass. The reflection that looked back at her was faint, layered over the dark outside. She didn't study it. She didn't search for answers there. She just stood. The feeling of being behind softened slightly. Not gone, just quieter. Like a note that didn't need to be resolved right away. She returned to the bed and lay back down, this time pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. The room held her without comment. It didn't ask where she was going next. It didn't ask if she was doing enough. It just existed, complete in its temporary way. Ava closed her eyes. For the first time that evening, she allowed the thought to settle without argument. Maybe this part isn't missing anything. Maybe it's just not finished yet. The air conditioner continued its steady rhythm. The light outside didn't change. The song of her life stayed right where it was open, unresolved, still unfolding. And that, for now, was enough to rest inside. Ava didn't fall asleep right away. She lay there listening to the quiet mechanics of the room, the steady hum of the air conditioner, the faint electrical buzz inside the walls, the distant sound of tires on asphalt far below. None of it asked for her attention. It was the kind of background noise that didn't interrupt thought, but gently slowed it. Her mind wandered again, but this time without urgency. She thought about all the moments she'd labeled as in between. The jobs that weren't quite careers. The relationships that mattered, but didn't last. The cities she passed through without planting roots. She had treated those chapters like placeholders, like they were supposed to lead somewhere else, before they could count. But lying here now, she wondered if that was fair. Songs didn't rush to their endings. They lingered. They repeated phrases. They left space between notes. Ava rolled onto her back and placed one hand on her chest, feeling the gentle rise and fall beneath her palm. Her heartbeat was calm, unremarkable, steady enough to trust. She remembered being younger and assuming that clarity would arrive all at once. That one day she'd wake up knowing exactly who she was and what came next. That life would lock into place like a finished composition. Instead, it had kept improvising. And maybe that wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was the nature of being alive. She thought about the notebook again, about all the half-written lines she'd collected over the years. She'd always told herself she'd finish them later when she understood more. But maybe the unfinished lines weren't waiting to be completed. Maybe they were meant to stay open like questions that didn't need answers to be meaningful. The room felt softer now, as if the edges had blurred. Ava adjusted the pillow under her head and felt her shoulders sink deeper into the mattress. The tension she'd carried earlier, the sense that she was running out of time, had loosened its grip. She wasn't late. She wasn't early. She was simply here inside this measure of the song. Outside, a car door closed. Someone laughed briefly, then the sound faded. Life continued without announcing its purpose, without explaining itself. Ava let her breathing follow the rhythm of the room. In, out. No effort, no correction. She realized she'd been judging her life as if it were already over, as if the ending had been written and she was falling short of it. But you couldn't judge a melody before it resolved. You couldn't call a song incomplete when it was still being played. The pressure to define herself softened. She didn't need to know where everything was leading. She didn't need to label this chapter. She didn't need to turn her uncertainty into a problem to solve tonight. Some parts of life were meant to be lived before they were understood. Ava's thoughts slowed, further drifting like notes stretched longer than usual. The sense of being unfinished no longer felt like a failure. It felt like permission. Permission to continue without explanation. Permission to rest without resolution. The hotel room stayed quiet and neutral, offering no commentary. The temporary nature of it all felt strangely comforting. Nothing here was asking her to stay forever. Nothing was asking her to leave either, just to be. Ava's hand slipped from her chest to the mattress beside her. Her fingers relaxed, curling naturally. The last clear thought that passed through her mind was gentle and unforced. The song isn't done, and it doesn't need to be. Sleep came quietly after that, not as a reward, not as a conclusion, but as a pause between notes. The music continued somewhere beneath it all, unhurried, still unfolding. The parking lot was still dark when Marcus turned the key. The engine came to life with a low, familiar sound, steady and unremarkable. He didn't pull out right away. He let the car sit there, headlights off dashboard, glowing softly in front of him. It was that hour before morning, fully decided to arrive, the sky not quite black, not quite blue. Marcus rested his forearms on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield. The road ahead was empty. No traffic, no rush. Just pavement stretching forward, waiting. He'd been awake for a while. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because his body had learned this schedule too well. Years of early shifts had trained him to rise before the world did, to move before anyone asked. He liked that about himself. He liked being reliable. He liked being the one who showed up. But lately, something about that had started to feel heavy. Marcus was 41 now. A UPS driver. Strong hands, strong back. The kind of person people counted on without thinking much about it. When something needed to be carried, he carried it. When something needed to be done, he did it. And somewhere along the way, he'd begun to wait. Not consciously, not dramatically, just quietly. He waited for someone to notice, for someone to say, "You're doing enough," for someone to turn on a light and tell him he was headed in the right direction. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. He didn't check the time. He knew it by feel. Marcus reached to the side and picked up his thermos, taking a slow sip of coffee. It was still hot, bitter, grounding. He set it back in the cup holder and exhaled. Across the lot, one streetlight flickered, then steadied. The light didn't reach far, just enough to illuminate a small patch of asphalt beneath it. Everything else stayed in shadow. Marcus watched it for a moment longer than necessary. It reminded him of something his grandfather used to say when Marcus was a kid, whenever he complained about not knowing what to do next. "Don't wait for the sun," his grandfather would say. "Light your own lamp, just enough to see the next step." Back then, Marcus hadn't understood what that meant. He'd thought it was about confidence or bravery or being loud about what you wanted. Now, sitting alone in his truck before dawn, it felt different. Maybe it wasn't about becoming brighter. Maybe it was about becoming steadier. Marcus rested back against the seat. The fabric was worn, molded to his shape over years of use. This truck had seen a lot of his days, early mornings, long routes, quiet lunches eaten alone. It had never asked him to explain himself. He thought about how often he'd measured his worth by how much he could carry, how much responsibility he could shoulder without complaining, how little light he needed from others to keep going. But lately, the waiting had crept in. Waiting for validation, waiting for reassurance, waiting for some external signal that all this effort meant something. The streetlight flickered again, then held. Marcus realized that it didn't illuminate the whole lot. It didn't need to. It only lit what was directly beneath it. Enough to stand, enough to move. He turned the headlights on. The road ahead brightened instantly, the beam cutting through the dimness. Not the whole road, just the part right in front of him. Enough to drive, enough to trust. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. He didn't need the whole path lit up. He didn't need guarantees. He didn't need permission. He just needed enough light for the next mile. Marcus put the truck in gear and eased forward, tires rolling softly over the asphalt. As he drove toward the exit, the sky ahead lightened almost imperceptibly. Morning would come whether he waited or not, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for it. The road stayed quiet as Marcus drove, the tires humming steadily beneath him. Streetlights passed one by one, each illuminating a small circle of pavement before falling behind. None of them tried to light the whole way. They did their part, then let go. Marcus kept his hands loose on the wheel. His shoulders, usually braced for a long day ahead, had softened. The familiar route unfolded in front of him, turns he knew by heart, intersections he could navigate without thinking. The truck moved forward easily, as if it too understood that there was no need to rush. He thought about how long he'd been waiting for something to change. Not the job, not the schedule, but the feeling that his life would somehow feel more complete once someone else acknowledged it. Like the weight he carried would feel lighter once it was seen. But driving like this in the early quiet, he noticed something different. The light he needed was already there. It didn't come as praise or recognition. It came as the steady glow of knowing what to do next. Turn here, slow down there, keep moving. Marcus remembered all the small choices he made each day that no one applauded. Getting up early, finishing routes, helping a neighbor load a box, calling his sister back even when he was tired. None of it felt heroic. None of it needed to. It was enough to be consistent. The sky continued to brighten just slightly, not enough to erase the darkness completely. Marcus didn't watch it closely. He let it happen in the background. He didn't need to track progress to trust that it was happening. He took another sip of coffee. It had cooled a bit, but the taste was still familiar, comforting. He smiled faintly, thinking about how many mornings had started exactly like this. How many he'd rushed through half-present, waiting for something else to arrive. This morning felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he wasn't asking it to. Marcus reached a long stretch of road with no lights at all. Just darkness beyond the headlights. The beam ahead held steady, revealing the lane lines and the edges of the road. Enough to keep going. He thought about his grandfather again. About the way he'd spoken without drama, as if what he was saying didn't need to be impressive to be true. Light your own lamp. It didn't mean doing everything alone. It didn't mean shutting people out. It meant not giving away the responsibility of your own sense of direction. It meant trusting that your inner sense of enough didn't have to be approved by anyone else. Marcus felt his breathing deepen naturally, matching the rhythm of the drive. In, out. The road flowed under him mile by mile. He wasn't thinking about the rest of the day anymore. He wasn't rehearsing conversations or counting stops. He was just here in motion, guided by a light that moved with him. The truck turned into another lot, then another street. The world was waking slowly now. A few cars appeared. A storefront sign flickered on. Ordinary life beginning again. Marcus parked briefly, shut off the engine, and sat in the quiet that followed. The sudden stillness felt complete, not empty. He rested his hands in his lap and closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't feel the need to ask whether this was enough. It was. The light had done its job. The path had revealed itself step by step. And Marcus, steady and unremarkable in the best way, continued on. The oil lamp didn't burn brighter than necessary. It simply stayed lit. And that was all it ever needed to do. Lila sat in her car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel long after the drive was over. The parking lot was quiet, washed in pale yellow light from a single lamp above. She could still smell the hospital on her clothes, cleaning solution latex, something faintly metallic. The smell lingered no matter how many times she told herself the shift was finished. She hadn't turned the radio on. She hadn't checked her phone. She just sat there breathing slowly, letting the silence press in around her. It had been a heavy day, not dramatic, not urgent, just heavy in the way hospice days often were. Quiet conversations, long pauses, a hand held a little longer than usual, a goodbye that didn't need words. Lila was good at this work. She knew how to be present without fixing, how to sit beside someone without filling the space. People often told her she had a calming presence, as if it were something she'd been born with. They didn't see the weight she carried afterward. She reached for the small towel she kept in the car and wiped her hands, even though they were already clean. It was a habit she'd developed over time, not to remove dirt exactly, but to mark a transition. Work to home, holding to releasing. Still, some days, it didn't feel like enough. Lila leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes. Images from the day drifted through her mind, not sharply, but insistently. A quiet room, a shallow breath, a family member standing in the doorway, unsure where to put their grief. She felt tired in a way sleep didn't always touch. A thought surfaced, one she didn't like but knew well. Why does so much pain pass through me? Not as a complaint, more as a wondering, as if she were trying to understand the cost of caring. Outside the car, the night air had cooled. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked on water, hissing softly against grass. The sound grounded her, pulling her attention outward for a moment. Lila opened her eyes and looked at her hands again. They were steady, capable. Ordinary hands that had done extraordinary things simply by staying. She thought about something she'd learned early on, back when she first started volunteering. An older nurse had said it casually one afternoon while they stood washing their hands side by side. Nothing grows clean, she'd said. Not the good stuff. At the time, Lila hadn't known what to make of it. It sounded like one of those phrases people repeat without thinking. But over the years, the meaning had settled in. She pictured a lotus the way she'd once seen it in a book, blooming above dark water roots, buried deep in thick mud. The image wasn't pretty if you looked too closely at the bottom. But the flower itself wasn't diminished by where it came from. It was shaped by it. Lila exhaled slowly. The idea didn't erase the day. It didn't turn grief into something beautiful. It simply reframed it just enough to keep her from pushing it away. Maybe the mud wasn't a sign she was doing something wrong. Maybe it was the ground she was growing from. She sat there longer than usual, letting that thought rest without arguing with it. She didn't need to believe it fully. She just needed to let it exist alongside the tiredness. When she finally opened the car door, the cool air met her skin. She stepped out and stretched her shoulders, feeling the tightness release slightly. The night sky above was dark, cloudless. No stars visible from this lot. That was okay. Not every place needed to be beautiful. Lila walked toward her building keys, in hand, footsteps slow, With each step, the day felt a little less sticky. Not gone, just less attached. She knew tomorrow would bring more of the same. More quiet endings. More moments she couldn't fix. More weight. But she also knew something else now. Something she'd learned not from books, but from standing where she stood. What grew in her wasn't despite the mud. It was because of it. Inside her apartment, Lila moved slowly, as if the night itself had asked her not to rush. She set her keys down in the same small bowl by the door, hung her jacket on the hook, and slipped off her shoes. The familiar sounds of home settled around her, the soft click of the lamp turning on the distant hum of a refrigerator. The quiet steadiness of a place that asked nothing from her. She washed her hands again at the sink, letting the water run longer than necessary. Not to clean, but to feel. Warmth over skin. Movement without effort. She dried them carefully and noticed how her shoulders had dropped without her telling them to. Lila walked into the living room and sat on the couch, feet tucked beneath her. The cushion gave way gently. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle instead of resisting it. The images returned softer now. Faces, voices, silence. They didn't demand anything. They just passed through like clouds moving slowly across a night sky. She realized something she hadn't always understood when she was younger. That caring didn't mean carrying everything forever, that being open didn't require staying soaked. There was a difference between allowing something to touch you and letting it drown you. The lotus came to her mind again. Not as a picture this time, but as a feeling. The sense of something rising steadily without hurry through thick water. It didn't curse the mud. It didn't rush past it. It simply used it. Lila placed one hand on her chest and felt her breathing steady, quiet, alive. Her heart beat on, unconcerned with the stories she told herself about the day. It just kept going, faithful and patient. She thought about how often people praised strength without understanding what it was made of. How they admired calm without seeing the effort beneath it. How they loved the flower but forgot the soil. But the soil remembered. The mud held everything. The mess, the decay, the nutrients. Without it, there was nothing to rise from. Lila didn't feel lighter exactly. The weight was still there. But it had shifted, settling lower, no longer pressing against her chest. It felt like something she could rest on instead of something she had to fight. She stretched her legs out along the couch and adjusted the blanket over her lap. The fabric was soft, worn just enough to feel familiar. She let her head rest against the cushion and noticed how easily her body fit into the space. Tonight didn't need to be resolved. Nothing needed to be transformed. The work she did mattered not because it was clean or uplifting, but because it was real, because it met life where it actually was not where it wished it could be. Lila's breathing slowed further. Each inhale felt less deliberate, each exhale a little longer. The room grew quieter, or maybe she simply noticed it less. She thought about tomorrow, not with dread, not with planning, but with acceptance. Another day would come, more mud, more moments of quiet courage, more small acts that no one would see, and that was fine. The lotus didn't bloom all at once. It didn't hurry. It didn't apologize for where it grew. Lila let that image soften and fade, leaving only the sense of steady rising of something alive and intact beneath everything. Her eyes stayed closed. The room held her gently. The night did not ask her to be anything other than what she already was. Rooted, breathing, still growing. And for now, that was enough. The locker room smelled like metal and soap. Noah sat on the bench with his boots unlaced, elbows resting on his knees, helmet placed carefully on the floor in front of him. The room was mostly empty now. A few lockers stood open, their doors swinging slightly before settling back into stillness. Somewhere down the hall, a shower ran water hitting tile in a steady rhythm. Noah rubbed a towel across the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. It hadn't been a bad call. No one was hurt. No fire had spread. Everything had gone the way it was supposed to. And yet his body felt worn in that familiar way, like something inside him had been scraped a little thinner. He picked up his helmet and turned it in his hands. The surface was scuffed, dulled from years of use. A few scratches caught the light. None of them new, none of them dramatic. Just the quiet evidence of repetition. People often talked about his job like it was all adrenaline and heroics. But most days, it wasn't like that. Most days were about patience, about waiting, about being ready for something that might not happen. And when it did happen, about staying steady under pressure. That steadiness came at a cost. Noah slid the helmet back into his locker and closed the door. The metal clanged softly final. He leaned back against the bench and stared at the floor, letting his breathing slow. Lately, he'd been feeling the weight of it more than usual. Not fear, not doubt about his ability, something quieter. The sense that each challenge left a mark even when things went well. That each test, each difficult moment was sanding something down inside him. He wondered sometimes if all this friction was slowly wearing him away. An older firefighter had once said something to him during a long night shift years ago. They'd been sitting on the back step of the station drinking burnt coffee, watching the sky lighten just enough to signal morning. "You know what they do with jade?" the man had said out of nowhere. "They don't cut it clean. They grind it. Over and over. Takes forever." Noah hadn't known what to say at the time. He'd nodded, half listening, half exhausted. Now the memory surfaced again, unexpectedly clear. Jade didn't start out smooth. It wasn't impressive at first glance. It was dense, rough, hard to shape. And the only way it became something people valued was through repeated polishing, through friction. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily over time. Noah flexed his hands, noticing the faint soreness in his fingers. These hands had learned how to hold steady when things shook, how to grip, release, adjust. They bore small scars he rarely thought about anymore. He'd always assumed that being tested meant something was wrong. That struggle was a sign of weakness. That if things were truly aligned, they would feel easier. But the jade didn't become dull because it was polished. It became clear. Noah stood and stretched his arms overhead, feeling the tightness along his shoulders release a little. The room seemed quieter now, the earlier energy fully drained away. He thought about the moments that had shaped him the most. They weren't the ones where everything went perfectly. They were the moments that had demanded something from him: patience, restraint, courage, humility. Moments that had forced him to slow down and stay present. Each one had felt uncomfortable at the time. Each one had left him changed. He picked up his jacket and slipped it on the familiar weight settling around him. It felt grounding, like a reminder of who he was when things got hard. The locker room lights flickered briefly, then steadied. Noah turned toward the door, pausing for a second before leaving. Maybe he wasn't being worn down. Maybe he was being refined. The thought didn't erase the fatigue. It didn't make the work lighter, but it gave the weight a different shape, one he could carry without resentment. Noah reached for the door handle and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The night beyond waited calmly, indifferent to what he'd just been through. And for the first time that evening, he felt less like something was being taken from him, and more like something was being revealed. The hallway outside the locker room felt cooler, quieter. Noah's footsteps echoed softly as he walked toward the exit, the sound fading almost as soon as it appeared. The building had settled for the night. Whatever urgency had filled it earlier was gone now, replaced by a steady calm that didn't need explanation. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of asphalt and damp grass. A few stars were visible above the station, dim but present. Noah paused, hands in his jacket pockets, and let the night meet him where he was. His body still felt tired. That hadn't changed, but the tiredness no longer felt like something he needed to fight. It felt earned, honest, like a signal that he had stayed present when it mattered. He thought again about the Jade, about how polishing wasn't about force. It was about consistency. Pressure applied slowly, carefully, with attention. Too much and the stone cracked. Too little and nothing changed. The process demanded patience more than strength. That felt familiar. Noah had learned over the years how to stay with difficult moments without rushing past them. How to respond instead of react. How to trust his training when instinct wanted to take over. None of that showed up as brilliance from the outside. It showed up as quiet reliability. And that reliability had been shaped, not gifted. He walked toward his car and unlocked it, the sound of the door opening small and final in the quiet lot. Before getting in, he leaned against the side of the vehicle, feeling the cool metal through his jacket. He remembered times when he'd wished things were easier, when he'd wondered why certain challenges kept returning slightly different, but familiar enough to recognize. He'd thought he was failing to move past something. Now the pattern looked different. The repetition wasn't punishment. It was practice. Each time he stayed steady, something inside him smoothed out just a little more. Each time he chose patience over force, clarity over impulse. He became more himself, not less. Noah sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. The interior light clicked on briefly, then went dark. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and took a slow breath in, then out. The mind liked to tell stories about struggle, that it meant damage, that it meant loss. But the body often knew better. The body understood adaptation. It understood how friction could strengthen instead of weaken. He started the car and let it idle, not in a hurry to leave. The engine's low vibration traveled up through the seat, grounding him. Noah didn't feel proud. He didn't feel accomplished. What he felt was something quieter and more stable, a sense of trust. Trust that what he was going through was shaping him in ways he couldn't fully see yet. The jade didn't shine while it was being polished. It didn't announce its progress. It simply endured the process slowly, becoming clear. Noah pulled out of the lot and onto the road. The station disappeared behind him, lights dimming in the rearview mirror. The route home was familiar. He didn't need directions. As he drove, the tension in his shoulders eased. His thoughts loosened their grip. The day began to recede, leaving behind only what was necessary. He wasn't broken. He wasn't behind. He was becoming. The road stretched ahead, dark and open. Noah followed it, calmly illuminated, just enough to keep moving. Whatever came next would bring its own friction. He knew that, but now it felt less like something to fear and more like part of the shaping. The jade would continue to be polished, and in its own time, it would shine. The phone was still in her hand when Priya realized she hadn't heard her own thoughts in hours. The room was dim lit, only by a small lamp on the nightstand. Outside traffic passed in slow waves, the sound softened by distance and glass. Priya lay on her bed with one leg bent, the other stretched out, scrolling without really seeing anything. Opinions, updates, advice, noise. Her thumb moved automatically, trained by habit more than interest. Every post seemed to carry a suggestion, what to care about, what to fix, what to become. None of it was meant specifically for her, but all of it felt oddly personal. She sighed and locked the screen, placing the phone face down beside her. The sudden quiet felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room after music stops. Priya stared at the ceiling. She'd always been good at listening. At work, she absorbed feedback easily, adjusted quickly, stayed aware of expectations. Among friends, she picked up on moods, unspoken tensions, shifts in tone. She had learned early that paying attention kept things smooth. But somewhere along the way, listening had turned outward almost entirely. Lately, she'd felt unsure in small ways. Not lost, just disconnected. Decisions that used to feel simple now came with hesitation. She found herself asking for reassurance more often, checking reactions before trusting her own instincts. It wasn't that she didn't have an inner voice. It was that it had become very quiet. Priya rolled onto her side and pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. The fabric brushed softly against her skin. She adjusted the pillow until it felt just right, then stilled. In the absence of the phone's glow, the room felt larger, slower. Her breathing, which she hadn't noticed before, became more obvious, steady, a little shallow, then deeper. She remembered something her mother used to say when Priya was younger, usually when she was overwhelmed or unsure. If you can't hear yourself, she'd say, it doesn't mean you're lost. It just means the room is loud. At the time, Priya hadn't thought much of it. Now, lying here with the world temporarily muted, the words surfaced gently. She closed her eyes. At first there was nothing, just static, leftover thoughts from the day. Half-finished conversations, to-do lists that hadn't gotten the message that the day was over. She didn't push them away. She let them pass. Slowly the noise thinned. Priya noticed the smallest sensations, the weight of the blanket, the warmth of the mattress, the way her jaw loosened when she wasn't paying attention to it. These weren't messages or insights, just signals that she was here. And then beneath all that, something softer. Not words, not instructions, a sense. It was easy to miss, like a whisper that didn't insist on being heard. It didn't argue. It didn't explain itself. It simply felt true, familiar, almost shy. Priya didn't try to name it. She stayed still, afraid that effort might make it disappear. She realized how different this felt from the noise she usually responded to. The loud opinions came with urgency, with pressure, with certainty about what should be done next. This quiet voice didn't rush. It didn't compete. It waited. Priya breathed in slowly, then out. The quiet didn't go away. It stayed right where it was, not asking to be followed, just asking to be noticed. She thought about how often she'd mistaken volume for wisdom, how often she'd trusted what spoke the loudest, the fastest, the most confidently, and how that had slowly taught her to doubt what arrived gently. The quiet voice wasn't fragile. It was patient. It had been there the whole time. Priya turned slightly onto her back, one hand resting on her stomach. Her breathing deepened again naturally, as if her body recognized the moment before her mind did. She didn't need to decide anything tonight. She didn't need to act on what she felt. She just needed to remember that it existed. The lamp cast a soft circle of light on the wall. The rest of the room stayed in shadow. The outside world continued, but it felt farther away now. Priya let herself stay in that space where nothing demanded her attention, where no one else's voice crowded the room. The quiet voice didn't say much, but it was enough to know it was there. Priya stayed where she was, letting the stillness settle around her. The room felt different now. Not emptier, just calmer. Like a lake after the wind passes when the surface smooths out on its own. The sounds from outside hadn't disappeared completely, but they no longer pulled at her attention. They moved in the background, unimportant. Her breathing slowed without effort. Each inhale felt softer. Each exhale a little longer, as if her body was finally being allowed to finish a sentence it had been holding. The quiet voice didn't grow louder. It didn't need to. It stayed exactly the same, gentle, steady, unconcerned with whether she noticed it again tomorrow. It wasn't there to persuade her or push her toward a decision. It wasn't there to compete with anything else. It simply existed. Priya realized how much trust that required. To speak without urgency, to offer guidance without force, to wait without fear of being ignored. She thought about how often she'd overridden that voice in the past, not because it was wrong, but because it was subtle. Because it didn't come wrapped in certainty or approval. Because it didn't sound like anyone else. But lying here now, she could feel the difference between what calmed her and what agitated her. Between what felt aligned and what felt imposed. The quiet voice didn't make her anxious. It didn't make her feel behind. It made her feel settled. Priya shifted slightly, pulling the blanket higher. The fabric brushed her chin, warm and familiar. Her thoughts wandered, but they no longer demanded answers. They drifted like loose threads, not problems to solve. She remembered moments when she'd followed that inner sense without knowing why, choosing a path that didn't make sense to others, saying no when yes would have been easier, leaving something that looked good on the outside but felt wrong on the inside. Those moments hadn't always been comfortable, but they had been honest. The quiet voice wasn't always about comfort. It was about truth. And truth, she realized, didn't need to shout to be real. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, fingers relaxed. She felt the subtle movement of breath beneath her palm. This body knew things too. It tightened when something was off. It softened when something was right. It had been speaking all along. Priya smiled faintly, not at a thought, but at the realization that she wasn't broken for feeling uncertain. She hadn't lost her way. She had simply been listening in the wrong direction for a while. The noise of the day faded further. Tomorrow didn't press in. The past loosened its grip. There was only this moment, quiet, unremarkable, complete. She didn't promise herself she'd always listen better from now on. She didn't turn the insight into a rule or a goal. She knew the noise would return. It always did. But now she also knew where to find herself when it did. The quiet voice didn't leave. It stayed beneath everything like a steady current under the surface. Always there, always accessible, never demanding. Priya's eyes remained closed as sleep began to approach, not abruptly, but gradually. Her thoughts thinned, stretched, then softened into something less defined. The last clear sensation she noticed was a feeling of trust, not in outcomes, not in certainty, but in her own inner rhythm. The world could keep talking. She knew how to listen inward now, and that was enough to rest. There was an extra chair pulled up to the kitchen island, and no one was sitting in it. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Earlier, the space was tight, crowded with bags, mail, a half-empty water bottle, a laptop pushed to one side. Everything had a place, and that place was usually right where the hands could reach it. Nothing was meant to rest. Everything was meant to be ready. Now, it was late. The overhead light was off, leaving only the small yellow lamp above the sink. The dishwasher hummed in its steady, forgettable way, like a sound the house made when it was allowed to take care of itself. Outside, a car passed once, then the street went quiet again. The chair was plain, wooden, nothing special. It had been pulled over almost without thinking, just slid across the floor until it faced the island. The person standing there didn't sit down right away. They leaned against the counter instead, arms crossed, shoulders lifted a little higher than necessary. All day, there had been things to hold. A meeting that needed preparation, a message that couldn't be ignored, a problem that wasn't technically theirs, but somehow still ended up in their hands. Even dinner had been eaten quickly, standing up fork, resting on the edge of the sink between bites. There was always a sense that if they stopped moving, something might fall apart. The body remembered that feeling now, even though the day was technically over. The shoulders stayed tight. The jaw didn't quite unclench. The mind kept scanning like it was still on duty, waiting for the next thing that might need attention. The empty chair didn't ask for anything. It just stayed where it was. For a moment, the person noticed an odd irritation rise up. The chair felt unnecessary, in the way, like a pause that hadn't been earned yet. There was still tomorrow to think about, still loose ends, still that quiet pressure to be useful to prove something even to an empty room. They reached for a mug and filled it with water, then set it down on the island without drinking. The dishwasher hummed. A soft click came from somewhere inside it, a small mechanical decision being made without any help. There was a memory, faint but persistent, of being younger and being told to wait, to stand back, to make room. Someone else needed the seat more. Someone else mattered more in that moment. It wasn't said cruelly. It didn't have to be. It was just the way things were arranged. Over time, standing became normal, hovering, being ready, being available. The chair scraped softly as it was pulled back a few inches. The sound was louder than expected in the quiet kitchen. The person paused, hands still on the top rail, as if surprised by their own movement. They sat down slowly. At first it felt wrong, too exposed, like sitting meant admitting something they weren't sure they were allowed to admit yet. The back of the chair pressed gently between the shoulder blades. The feet found the floor. The body registered contact, weight, support. Nothing dramatic happened. The room didn't change. The to-do list didn't disappear. Tomorrow didn't cancel itself. But something inside the chest loosened just enough to be noticeable. It's strange how unfamiliar rest can feel when you haven't practiced it in a while. Not the kind of rest that comes from collapsing at the end of the day, but the kind that comes from choosing to stop before you're forced to. The kind that says, just for now, this is enough. The person noticed how the island looked from this angle, how the edge was worn smooth in one spot, how a small crumb had been missed during cleaning. Ordinary details suddenly visible when the body wasn't leaning forward anymore. They rested their hands on their thighs. The fingers twitched once, like they were checking whether they were allowed to be empty. The mind tried out of habit to fill the space. You should answer that email. You forgot to follow up. You could be doing more right now. The thoughts arrived the way they always did, lined up and confident, like they belonged there. But tonight they didn't land quite as hard. It was as if the chair absorbed some of the impact. As if having a place to sit gave the body permission not to obey every instruction immediately. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never letting yourself arrive anywhere. From always being slightly ahead of the moment you're in, reaching for the next thing, before this one is even settled. The person noticed their breathing, not in a deliberate way, just noticed that it had slowed. The inhale wasn't rushed. The exhale went a little longer than expected, like the body was surprised it had the time. The empty chair across from them stayed empty. It didn't accuse, it didn't compare. It didn't ask them to earn the right to be there. It simply marked a space where effort wasn't required. For the first time that evening, the person let their shoulders drop fully. Not all at once, just a fraction, enough to feel the difference. Enough to realize how high they'd been holding them all day without noticing. They stayed there longer than they meant to. Not because they were trying to heal anything, not because they were making a point, just because for once, nothing was pulling them away. And somewhere in that quiet kitchen with the dishwasher humming and the extra chair holding its place, a small truth settled in. Without words, a maybe rest isn't something you get after everything is done. Maybe it's something you're allowed to take, even when the world keeps going. They didn't stay seated the whole time. After a while, they stood up again, almost out of habit. Rinsed the mug in the sink, wiped a small spill on the counter. The body still knew its routines, still wanted to be useful, still wanted to justify its presence by doing something that looked productive. But when they were done, they didn't rush away. They pulled the chair back again. This time the movement felt less strange, less like stealing time, more like returning to a place that had been there all along. Sitting down didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt normal, which surprised them. The dishwasher clicked and shifted into a new cycle. A deeper, slower hum filled the kitchen, like the house had decided to settle for the night. The lamp over the sink cast a soft shadow on the wall, uneven and imperfect. Nothing in the room looked curated or impressive. It just looked lived in. From this stillness, another thought surfaced. Not sharp, not demanding, just quiet and persistent. What if I don't have to earn my place here? The idea felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. Somewhere along the way, rest had become something that had to be justified. You rest after you finish. You sit once you've proven your value. You stop only when there's nothing left that could possibly need you. But there was always something left. The person thought about how often they'd made space for others without hesitation. Pulled out chairs, adjusted schedules, listened longer than they had energy for, said yes even when their body was already tired. It wasn't resentment they felt now, just a soft recognition of a pattern that had been running quietly for years. They had learned to be the one who stands by, stands in, stands ready. And over time, standing became part of how they measured their worth. If they were needed, they mattered. If they were useful, they belonged. Sitting down felt like disappearing. The empty chair across from them broke that spell a little. It was still there, still unoccupied, still unnecessary in the most ordinary way. And yet it held something important, the idea that space doesn't have to be taken from someone else to exist, that making room for yourself doesn't mean pushing anyone out. The person rested their elbows lightly on the island. The cool surface grounded them, They noticed how the day had finally reached their hands and feet. How tiredness, when allowed to arrive, felt different from exhaustion. Softer, more honest. There's a difference between being worn down and being allowed to stop. They had mistaken one for the other for a long time. The mind tried again to fill the quiet. You could be better than this. You should be further along. Other people don't need this much rest. The thoughts came, but now they were quieter, less convincing, like echoes in a room that had already emptied. The person didn't argue with them, didn't correct them, didn't try to replace them with something more positive. They just let the thoughts pass through the way sound passes through a space, without leaving marks on the walls. They stayed seated. The chair held their weight without comment. In that simple support, something shifted. Not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to change the tone of the evening. The pressure to be impressive softened. The need to justify their existence loosened its grip. They didn't suddenly feel confident or healed or whole in some dramatic sense. They just felt present. And present, it turned out, was enough for the night. The value they had been chasing all day wasn't missing. It hadn't been delayed or denied. It had just been quiet, waiting for them to stop running long enough to notice it. Value didn't come from what they completed, or how much they carried, or how little space they took up. It was already there in the body, sitting in the chair, in the breath moving without effort, in the simple fact of being here, even when nothing was being produced. They looked once more at the empty chair across from them and understood it differently now. It wasn't empty because no one deserved it. It was empty because there was finally room. Room to sit without proving anything. Room to rest without explanation. Room to exist without performing. Eventually, they would stand again. Turn off the lamp. Walk down the hallway. Tomorrow would come as it always did, with its lists and demands and small urgencies. But something would go with them. The memory of that chair. The feel of being supported without conditions. The quiet knowing that their worth hadn't changed based on how much they did. And even when the chair was pushed back under the table, even when the kitchen returned to its usual arrangement, that space would still exist. Not in the room, but inside them. A place they could return to. A place that didn't need to be earned. The garden was smaller than they remembered. Not tiny, not disappointing, just quieter. Tucked behind the house, partly hidden by a leaning fence and a line of bushes that had grown uneven over the years. In the daytime, it was easy to overlook. From the kitchen window, it looked like nothing special. Just dirt, some green, a few stubborn patches where weeds had taken over. But at night, with the string lights turned on and the air cooling down, it felt like a different place. They stepped outside barefoot, the wood of the deck cool under their feet. The door closed softly behind them, and the sounds of the house faded. Inside, there were still reminders, phones, messages, unfinished thoughts. But out here, the night held things more gently. They hadn't planned to come into the garden. Earlier, they'd been scrolling on the couch phone, glowing in the dim living room. watching other lives unfold in neat rectangles, smiling faces, announcements, new beginnings that looked clean and confident. Each swipe carried a quiet question. Why does everyone else seem so ready? The feeling wasn't jealousy exactly, more like a soft ache, a sense of being behind or unfinished or not quite ready to be seen. So they stood up without much thought, slipped on a sweater, and stepped outside. The garden didn't greet them. It didn't offer comfort or answers. It just existed. Leaves rustled lightly in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked on and off its rhythm, steady and unconcerned. They walked slowly along the narrow path, noticing details they usually ignored. A plant that had grown sideways, leaning toward the light. Soil that had dried and cracked near the edges. A corner where nothing had taken root at all. It was clear they hadn't been tending this place much. Life had been full lately, full of adjusting to other people's needs, full of trying to be open, available, understanding, full of letting others in before they were sure they themselves felt steady. There was a time when they believed healing happened through connection alone, through being chosen, through being seen by someone else and held there long enough to feel real again. But standing in the garden now, they noticed something simple and uncomfortable at the same time. Nothing here was growing because someone else liked it. Nothing here was blooming for approval. The garden didn't perform. They knelt down near a small patch of soil, brushing their fingers across the surface. It was dry, but not dead. Beneath the top layer, there was still coolness, still potential. They could feel it. A memory surfaced of inviting people in too soon, of sharing tender parts before they had learned how to protect them, of hoping someone else would know what to do with the pieces they themselves didn't yet understand. The intention had always been good. They weren't careless. They were just eager to feel whole again, eager to skip the slow part. They reached for the watering can resting against the fence. It was lighter than expected, nearly empty. They filled it halfway from the hose, listening as the water rushed in, then slowed. As they poured, the soil darkened instantly. The change was visible, immediate, satisfying in a quiet way. No one was watching. No one needed to know this was happening. It felt different from the effort they usually made. Usually care was outward facing. A text sent at the right time. A thoughtful response. A version of themselves shaped to fit the moment. That kind of care took energy and left very little behind. This kind of care stayed. They moved slowly, watering only where it was needed. Not everything at once. Just one section, then another. The sprinkler down the street kept ticking, a steady backdrop, like a reminder that growth doesn't rush even when no one is paying attention. As they worked, a thought formed, not sharp, not demanding. What if this space is meant for me first? Not as a rule, not as a boundary shouted out loud, just as a quiet order of things. Care inward, then outward. Roots before invitations. They realized how often they treated themselves like a shared space. Open hours, no clear edges. Anyone could enter any time. And when something was damaged, they blamed themselves for not being stronger. But gardens don't work that way. You don't invite people in while you're still planting seeds and expect them not to step on anything. You don't leave the gate wide open during a storm and wonder why things get uprooted. You tend. You protect. You learn the rhythm of the place. Only then do you open it. They set the watering can down and sat back on their heels. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. Crickets had started their low, uneven song. The lights above cast soft circles on the ground, leaving the rest in shadow. Nothing dramatic had changed. No sudden clarity. No feeling of being fully healed. But something had shifted. The garden felt less like something they were neglecting and more like something that was waiting. Patient. Unoffended. Ready to respond when given attention. They stayed there longer than they expected, hands resting loosely in their lap, watching the soil absorb what it needed. For the first time in a while, the urge to reach outward to check messages, to see who was thinking of them, to look for reassurance didn't feel so urgent. There was work to do here. Quiet work. Work that didn't ask to be witnessed. And for tonight, that felt like enough. They didn't fix everything that night. Some weeds were still there. Some patches stayed bare. The fence still leaned a little to the left, and one of the lights flickered when the breeze picked up. The garden didn't suddenly become beautiful in the way pictures online tend to be. And somehow, that made it easier to stay. They rinsed their hands with the hose and stood up slowly, feeling the stretch in their knees, the weight of their body settling back into itself. The soil clung lightly to their fingers, a quiet reminder that they'd been here, that they'd touched something real. As they walked the path again, they noticed where the ground dipped, where the stones didn't quite line up. These weren't flaws exactly, just signs of use, of time. It occurred to them that healing might look more like this than they'd expected. Not a reset, not a clean slate, just learning the shape of what's already there and caring for it without asking it to be different first. They sat on the low step at the edge of the garden, pulling the sweater tighter around their shoulders. The air had cooled enough to raise a light chill on their skin. Somewhere nearby, the sprinklers shut off, leaving behind a deeper kind of quiet. For a moment, they imagined inviting someone into this space. Not as a test, not as a hope that being chosen would fix something. Just as an offering made from a place that wasn't starving anymore. The image felt different from the ones they'd carried before. There was no urgency in it. No sense of please stay or don't leave. Just a calm curiosity about what it might be like to share something that was already tended. They realized how often they'd mistaken openness for healing. They'd believed that if they let people see everything, every crack, every fear, every unfinished piece, then closeness would come naturally. And sometimes it did. But often it came with confusion, with overstepping, with the quiet resentment that followed when their softness wasn't handled gently. It wasn't that others had done something wrong. It was that the garden hadn't been ready. They had opened the gate before learning how to care for the soil, before understanding which plants needed shade, which needed space, which ones grew slowly and couldn't be rushed. Sitting there now, they felt something soften in the way they thought about themselves. They hadn't failed at healing. They hadn't loved the wrong way. They had simply been tending outward before tending inward. And that wasn't a flaw, just an order that needed adjusting. They stood again and walked to the gate, resting their hand on the latch. It creaked softly under their touch. They didn't open it. They didn't close it tighter either. They just felt its weight the way it could move when asked. Choice felt like that sometimes. Not a decision shouted into the world, but a hand resting on a latch, aware that movement was possible. The lights overhead hummed faintly. A moth circled once, then disappeared into the dark. The garden breathed in its own quiet way, alive, but not demanding. They thought about tomorrow, about conversations that might happen, about invitations they might receive or offer. For the first time, those thoughts didn't feel heavy. They didn't need to decide anything tonight. Healing they were learning didn't ask for big promises. It asked for small, consistent care, for showing up in the same place again and again, even when no one else was there to notice. Before going inside, they turned back once more. The garden looked different now, not because it had changed, but because they had. It wasn't a place to escape into. It was a place to return to. A place that held them without needing anything in exchange. Inside the house, the couch and phone and familiar noises waited. Life would continue. Connections would form and fade as they always did. But there was a quiet understanding they carried with them as they stepped back inside. They didn't need to be fully healed to be worthy. They didn't need to be chosen to be whole. Their value wasn't waiting outside the gate. It was already rooted here. The parking lot was almost empty. Just a few cars scattered across the far rows, their windshields catching the last light of the day. The grocery store sign hummed faintly behind them, steady and indifferent. Somewhere near the entrance, a cart rattled as someone pushed it back into place, the sound echoing longer than it should have. They sat in their car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, not quite ready to go anywhere. Earlier, the day had fallen apart in a quiet way. No shouting, no dramatic ending. Just a short conversation that didn't go the way they'd hoped. A polite tone, a careful explanation. Words like, unfortunately and at this time. The kind of ending that leaves no clear edge to push against, no one to blame. Not even yourself yet, somehow still leaves a heaviness behind. Failure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in gently dressed as a reasonable outcome. They'd nodded, thanked the person on the other end, closed the laptop, done all the right things. And still the feeling followed them out the door, into the car, into the long pause before turning the key. Now the sky was changing. A thick layer of clouds hung low, dull and gray, like they'd been there all day. But near the horizon, something else was happening. A thin band of light pushed through soft and warm, coloring the edges of the clouds in pale gold. The sun hadn't disappeared. It had just been hidden. They noticed how quickly their mind had jumped to conclusions earlier. This means I'm not good enough. This proves I waited too long. This sets me back more than I can afford." The thoughts came fast, stacking on top of one another, each one sounding certain final, as if one moment could define the shape of an entire life. They leaned forward and wiped a small smudge from the inside of the windshield with their sleeve. The glass cleared just enough to sharpen the view. The light grew brighter for a second, then shifted again as the clouds moved. It occurred to them that the sun didn't argue with the clouds. It didn't rush them, didn't burn through them, didn't take their presence personally. It simply stayed where it was doing what it always did. There had been other days like this before, other moments that felt like proof of something going wrong. And yet looking back, those moments hadn't erased who they were. They hadn't taken away their ability to learn to try again, to show up differently next time. But in the middle of it, it never felt that way. In the middle of it, the clouds felt permanent. They remembered being younger, equating success with visibility. If something was seen, it mattered. If it wasn't acknowledged, it didn't count. Praise felt like sunlight. Silence felt like disappearance. Over time, that belief hardened. They learned to track their worth through outcomes, through approvals, through signs that others could see and name. So when something didn't work out, it didn't just feel disappointing. It felt like dimming. They sat back in the seat, feeling the cool fabric against their shoulders. The car next to them pulled out slowly, tires crunching against loose gravel. For a moment, the lot was quiet again. The sky kept changing. The clouds drifted, reshaping themselves without effort. Lights slid along their edges, sometimes bright, sometimes barely there. The scene refused to settle into a single interpretation. They took a breath, not deep, not intentional. Just the kind that happens when the body realizes it's safe to pause. What if this moment isn't saying anything about my value? The thought surprised them. Not because it felt obviously true, but because it felt possible. They had been treating the outcome like a verdict, a final word. But maybe it was closer to weather. Something that passed through, something that changed conditions without changing the sky itself. They thought about how often they'd admired resilience in others, how they'd watched people move through setbacks and still remain themselves, still kind, still capable, still worthy of respect even when things didn't go their way. Somehow, it had never occurred to them that the same might apply inward. The light near the horizon deepened, turning amber, then soft orange. For a brief moment, the clouds looked almost translucent, like thin fabric held up to a lamp. They felt a familiar ache in their chest, not sharp, just heavy. A mix of disappointment and tiredness. They didn't push it away, didn't label it as weakness. They let it sit there like the clouds sat in the sky. Failure, they were realizing, doesn't erase what came before it. It doesn't cancel effort. It doesn't rewrite your entire story unless you let it. It only blocks the view for a while. They stayed in the car longer than they needed to, watching the sky dim slowly, the colors fading into blue-gray. The sun slipped fully behind the clouds, now no longer visible at all. And still, they knew it was there. They turned the key but didn't drive off right away. The dashboard lights came on softly, casting a pale glow across the inside of the car. The radio stayed off. The world outside felt quiet enough on its own. The sky had lost most of its color, now settling into a calm, even gray. The disappointment was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it no longer felt like an emergency. There's a difference between pain that needs fixing and pain that just needs space. For a long time, they had treated every uncomfortable feeling like a problem to solve. If something hurt, it must mean something was wrong with them. If they felt stuck, it must mean they had failed in some essential way. Sitting there, watching the clouds thicken, they began to sense another option. Maybe this feeling didn't need a solution. Maybe it just needed permission to pass through. They thought about how often they had confused visibility with value. How praise felt like sunlight and silence felt like being erased. How easily one unanswered email could undo weeks of steady work in their mind. It wasn't that they believed others were shallow. It was that they had learned to see themselves through the same narrow lens. Outcome equals worth. Progress equals proof. Setback equals something missing. Those rules had never been spoken out loud, but they had shaped the way they moved through the world all the same. The clouds above continued their slow drift. Some thickened, some thinned. None of them stayed exactly as they were. The sun didn't fight them. It didn't try to shine harder to compensate. It didn't dim itself in response. It simply remained. The thought landed gently. What if my value is like that? Not something that appears only when conditions are perfect. Not something that has to be proven each time it's questioned. Just something that exists steady and unchanged, whether or not it's being seen. They felt a subtle shift in their chest. Not relief exactly, more like steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with what is. They had done their part. They had shown up. They had tried. The outcome was only one small piece of a much larger movement, one moment in a longer cycle. They started the car fully this time and eased out of the parking space. As they drove, the headlights cut through the dim evening, illuminating patches of road, one at a time. They didn't need to see the whole way, just the next few feet. That felt familiar. So much of their life had unfolded like this already, step by step. Light reaching only so far ahead. Trust built not from certainty, but from motion. A red light caught them at the edge of the lot. They stopped and waited. The clouds above were darker now, but the air felt cooler, calmer. They noticed how their breath matched the rhythm of the drive. Inhale at the stop. Exhale as the car rolled forward again. The body knew how to move through this, even if the mind still had questions. There would be other attempts, other conversations, other moments where things didn't go as planned. That wasn't a sign of deficiency. It was a sign of being in motion. Failure, when seen clearly, wasn't the opposite of worth. It was simply part of the weather. And weather changes. They merged onto the road's streetlights, passing overhead in a steady pattern. Each one lit up the windshield briefly, then disappeared behind them. The repetition was comforting, predictable in a way that didn't demand attention. They didn't feel triumphant. They didn't suddenly feel confident or resolved. They just felt intact, still themselves, still capable, still worthy of being here exactly as they were. The clouds could stay as long as they needed to. The sun wasn't going anywhere. The laundromat was nearly empty. Two machines hummed along the back wall, their metal doors spinning slowly, rhythm steady and unhurried. A vending machine glowed in the corner, offering snacks no one seemed interested in. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in the same pale wash. They sat on a hard plastic chair, laundry basket at their feet, phone resting loosely in their hand. It was late enough that no one expected conversation. People came here to wait to pass time, to let machines do work they didn't want to do themselves. No one asked questions. No one noticed much. They glanced at their phone again, not because there was anything new, but because habit pulled their thumb downward. Another scroll, another image, another life laid out in a clean frame. Someone announcing a promotion, someone smiling in a new city, someone else posting a caption about finally feeling like themselves. Each image landed quietly, but together they built a familiar weight. Everyone else is moving forward. The thought came without drama. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It just settled in heavy and convincing, like a fact that didn't need to be questioned. They locked the phone and slipped it into their pocket, feeling a brief sense of relief followed quickly by discomfort. Without the screen, there was nothing to distract from the feeling underneath. The dryers continued their slow rotation. A loose coin rattled inside one of the machines, tapping metal in a steady, uneven pattern. It sounded almost like a reminder, something small, out of place, but persistent. They stood up and walked to one of the washers, pressing their face close to the glass. Clothes tumbled through cloudy watercolors, blending together for a moment before separating again. Socks, shirts, a towel. Ordinary things, indistinguishable in motion. When the cycle ended, they opened the door and reached inside. Warmth met their hands, along with the faint smell of detergent. They pulled out a shirt, then another, stacking them carefully in the basket. As they worked, they noticed their hands. One thumb had a small scar near the joint, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. A thin white line left behind from years ago. They couldn't even remember how it happened anymore. It had become part of the landscape of their skin. They turned their hands slightly, watching the lines shift as their fingers moved. No two looked exactly the same. The ridges curved and split in patterns that felt deliberate, though they knew they weren't. Fingerprints. They had learned once in school that no two were identical, not in any meaningful way. Even among billions of people, each person carried something that had never been repeated and never would be. Standing there holding damp fabric, the thought felt strange. They had spent so much time measuring themselves against others, matching timelines, comparing achievements, wondering why their path looked slower, messier, less certain. It rarely occurred to them to question the comparison itself. You don't expect one fingerprint to match another. You don't call it a failure, when it doesn't. The idea hovered, not quite landing yet. They moved to a folding table and began laying clothes flat, smoothing out wrinkles with the side of their hand. The table was cool, its surface marked with scratches and faint stains from years of use. Countless people had stood here folding their own lives into neat stacks before carrying them back out into the world. They folded slowly, deliberately, a sleeve tucked in, a corner aligned, each movement simple, repetitive, calming. Their mind drifted back to the feeling they'd had earlier, that sense of being behind. It had followed them for months now, showing up in quiet moments like this, not as panic, but as a dull, constant pressure. I should be further along. I should know what I'm doing by now. Everyone else seems to have figured it out. They paused, hands resting on a folded shirt. What if the reason it feels impossible to catch up is because there's no one to catch up to? The question didn't bring immediate comfort. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Letting go of comparison meant letting go of the map they'd been using, even if that map had never really worked for them. They picked up another piece of clothing, this time noticing the small differences. The way fabric wore thin in some places. The way seams held despite strain. Each item carried signs of its own use, its own history. No two shirts had aged the same way, even if they'd been bought together. The dryers beeped softly one by one, signaling their cycles had ended. A man in a hoodie entered the laundromat, nodded without looking up, and loaded his clothes into a machine. The space adjusted to his presence, then settled again. They stacked the last folded item and sat back down, hands resting on their knees. Their fingers left faint prints on the smooth plastic of the chair. Not visible for long. Just a slight smudge that caught the light, then disappeared. Most of the time they felt invisible, like nothing about them stood out, like they were blending into the background of their own life. But fingerprints didn't announce themselves. They were there whether anyone noticed or not. They existed without needing approval. They waited as the machines cooled, the rhythm of the room steady and predictable. The weight in their chest hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It felt less like proof of failure and more like a habit, something learned, not something true. They reached for their phone again, then stopped. Let it stay in their pocket. They looked at their hands once more. The lines were still there, unchanged, quiet, and for the first time in a while, that felt like something solid to stand on. They finished folding and slid the last stack into the laundry basket. The basket felt heavier now, not just with clothes, but with the quiet satisfaction of something completed without rush. They carried it to the empty chair and sat down again. The plastic creaked softly under their weight. The dryers were still warm, giving off a low hum that filled the room without demanding attention. They rested their hands on the basket, fingers spread slightly, and noticed the faint impressions they left behind on the smooth lid. Not clear enough to study, not permanent. Just a brief mark of contact. It made them think about how often they'd tried to leave stronger impressions elsewhere. Trying to be louder, trying to be clearer, trying to be more impressive, more certain, more something. As if being unmistakable was the same thing as being valuable. They had spent years believing that if their life didn't look recognizable, if it didn't fit into familiar shapes and timelines, then it must be wrong. Too slow. Too late. Too different. But fingerprints were different by design. They weren't meant to line up. They weren't meant to be compared side by side and judged for consistency. Their value wasn't in how closely they matched, but in the fact that they never did. The thought settled slowly. What if my path isn't delayed, just distinct? The idea didn't come with a rush of confidence. It didn't erase doubt or suddenly make everything feel clear, but it softened something. It loosened the grip of that constant internal measuring stick. They looked around the laundromat again. Different loads, different fabrics, different people passing through at different times of night, carrying different weights. No one here was ahead or behind. They were all just here, waiting for the machines to finish trusting the process enough to sit still. They thought about moments in their life that hadn't made sense at the time. Detours that felt unnecessary. Pauses that felt embarrassing. Choices that didn't translate well when explained to others. Those moments hadn't been wasted. They had shaped the lines, added texture, created depth in places no one else could replicate. Just like the small scar on their thumb. Just like the ridges that bent and split in patterns no one had chosen, but only they carried. They flexed their fingers slowly, feeling the joints move, the skin stretch and settle back into place. The body knew itself in ways the mind often forgot. A dryer clicked off its door, unlocking with a soft metallic sound. They stood, lifted the basket, and moved toward the exit. The door chimed gently as they pushed it open, letting in a breath of cool night air. Outside, the street was quiet. A single streetlight flickered, then steadied. The world felt open in a way it hadn't earlier. Not because anything had changed, but because they weren't trying so hard to match it. They walked to their car and set the basket in the trunk. Before closing it, they paused, hands resting on the edge, feeling the chill of the metal. They didn't need to know exactly where they were headed next. They didn't need a clean narrative or a polished explanation. They didn't need proof that their life made sense to anyone else. Their value wasn't waiting at the end of a comparison. It was already present, pressed quietly into everything they touched. Like a fingerprint, not loud, not identical, but unmistakably their own. They closed the trunk and got into the car. As they drove away, the laundromat lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady flow of the road ahead. The lines on their hands stayed with them, unchanged, unrushed. Enough. They got home later than they meant to. Not because the work was impossible, but because leaving felt like letting something go. The last email, the last check, the last glance at the calendar, the small invisible rituals that made them feel like they were still in control. When they finally stepped inside, the house was quiet. No music, no TV, just the soft sound of the HVAC running a low, steady breath in the walls. A porch light spilled in through the front window, thin and pale. They stood in the entryway for a moment without moving, still wearing their outside self. The jacket, the shoes, the posture. That posture had become automatic over the years. Shoulders back, face neutral, eyes alert. The kind of body language that says, "I've got this." Even if underneath the body felt tired in places no one could see. They reached up and loosened the knot of their tie, then paused. Something about the motion made their chest tighten slightly, like removing it would mean admitting how much the day had taken out of them. So they left it on a little longer than necessary. In the hallway mirror, they caught their own reflection. The outfit still looked sharp. The hair was still in place. The expression was controlled, practiced, familiar. They had worked hard to build this version of themselves. Not in a vain way, in a survival way. A long time ago, they learned that being respected felt safer than being misunderstood. That looking capable often meant being left alone. That in certain rooms you had to arrive already armored. And over time, the armor got heavier. They stepped into the bedroom and opened the closet. The hangers were arranged neatly. Shirts grouped by color. Shoes lined up like a quiet parade. Everything in its place. Everything ready. They slipped the jacket off first. The fabric lifted away from their shoulders like a weight, leaving almost before they noticed it was there. They hung it carefully, smoothing the sleeve, adjusting the collar. It looked like nothing special on a hanger. Just cloth. They unbuttoned the shirt, folded it once, then twice the way they always did. The motions were efficient, practiced. In the background, a ceiling fan turned slowly, its soft whir filling the room, like a gentle metronome. They sat on the edge of the bed and stared at their hands. Even without the jacket, they still felt the day on their skin. A meeting that didn't go well. A moment where someone challenged them. The way their voice had stayed steady while their stomach tightened. The way they'd smiled at the right times. It was strange how quickly a person could become a role. At work, they were the one who knows, the one who can handle it, the one who keeps it together. Those titles weren't official, but they lived in people's expectations. And those expectations had their own gravity. They reached for the tie again and finally pulled it loose. The fabric slid through their fingers, smooth and cool, then fell into their lap. For a second, they just held it there. It hit them then how much they depended on the costume. Not for others, for themselves. The clothes were proof. Proof that they mattered. Proof that they belonged. Proof that they weren't the younger version of themselves anymore. The one who had been overlooked, underestimated, talked over. They stood and walked back to the closet, tie still in hand, and hung it beside the jacket. Seeing it there, still quiet, made something inside them shift. If the jacket is just cloth, then what was the power they'd been carrying all day? Where did it actually live? They turned away from the closet and looked around the room. A lamp on the dresser, a water glass, a small stack of books they kept meaning to read. Ordinary objects, indifferent to job titles, indifferent to performance. The room didn't care who they were outside. The ceiling fan kept turning. The air moved gently across their skin, and for a moment they felt the simplest thing. They were still here, not as a role, not as a reputation, not as an image, just as a person in a quiet room with a tired body. They sat down again this time, letting their shoulders drop fully. The release felt almost unfamiliar, like taking off shoes you didn't realize were too tight until they're gone. A thought rose up, soft but clear. What if I'm allowed to be myself after the cloak comes off? It wasn't a question about quitting or escaping. They weren't imagining throwing everything away. They had built a life. They had responsibilities. They cared about doing well. But somewhere along the way, the doing had started to replace the being. And if they were honest, the being had been waiting patiently underneath all of it, like skin under a uniform. They stood and walked to the bathroom, turning on the faucet. Water ran cold for a second, then warmed. They washed their hands slowly, watching the way the water moved over their fingers, clear and simple. No performance, no outcome, just water doing what water does. They dried their hands and returned to the bedroom. On the hanger, the jacket stayed perfectly still. It didn't look impressive anymore. It just looked like something that could be taken off. And that felt like a kind of freedom. Later that night, the house grew even quieter. The sounds of the day had faded. No notifications, no conversations replaying themselves quite as loudly. Just the low hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak as the house settled into itself. They lay back on the bed without turning off the light right away. One arm rested across their stomach, the other along the mattress. Their breathing slowed naturally, without effort, without instruction. Their eyes drifted to the closet again. The jacket hung there exactly as they had left it. Neat, proper, still holding the shape it had worn all day, as if waiting to be called back into service. The tie beside it caught the light, slightly smooth and polished. It struck them how small it all looked from here. Earlier, those things had carried weight, authority, expectation. Now, in the quiet, they looked almost fragile. Temporary. They thought about how easily the world confuses the symbols for the substance. Titles, clothing, access, attention. Those things can open doors. They can make life easier in certain ways. They can protect you in rooms where being seen as powerful matters. But they are not the power. They are the cloak. And cloaks by nature are meant to be worn and removed. The person lying there had worn many cloaks in their life. Student, new hire, expert, leader. Each one had taught them something. Each one had required a posture, a tone, a way of holding themselves. None of them had been false, but none of them had been the whole truth either. They shifted slightly on the bed, feeling the mattress give under their weight. The body underneath the rolls felt steady, solid, real in a way that didn't depend on being recognized. There was a quiet relief in that. They remembered moments when they had been afraid to take the cloak off, afraid that without it, they would disappear, that people would stop listening, that they would lose whatever respect they had earned. But here alone in the room, nothing vanished. They were still breathing, still thinking, still present. The respect they needed most tonight wasn't coming from outside anyway. It was coming from the simple act of letting themselves rest. They reached over and turned off the lamp. The room softened instantly, edges fading into shadow. The fan continued its slow rotation, steady and indifferent. In the dark, it was easier to tell the difference between what was carried and who was carrying it. The cloak hadn't given them their voice. It hadn't given them their judgment. It hadn't given them their capacity to care, to decide, to endure. Those things had been there before the jacket ever was. They would be there tomorrow too. Tomorrow they would put the cloak on again. Step back into the world. Play the roles that help things function. There is nothing wrong with that. The cloak had its place. But it wasn't fused to them. And tonight at least they were allowed to set it down. That knowledge settled in gently, like a hand placed on the chest. They didn't need to strip their life down to nothing to be real. They didn't need to reject success to keep their soul. They didn't need to choose between being capable and being human. They could wear the cloak without mistaking it for their skin. As sleep crept closer, one last thought passed through, simple and unforced. Even without the crown, even without the room, even without the name on the door, they were still the one living this life, and that was enough. They noticed it first in their hands. Not the pain exactly, but the dryness, the fine cracks near the knuckles, the way the skin felt tight when they closed their fingers, like it had been stretched too far and left there. It was late. The bathroom light was dimmed to its softest setting, the kind meant for nighttime. The rest of the house was quiet. No voices, no movement, just the faint sound of water moving through the pipes somewhere behind the walls. They turned on the faucet and let the water run warm, holding their hands underneath it longer than necessary. The heat felt good, grounding. When they turned the water off, the silence returned slowly, like the room was exhaling. On the counter sat a small bottle of lotion. Nothing special. No brand they were loyal to. Just something they'd picked up once because their hands hurt and it was there. They pressed the pump and watched the lotion pool in their palm. For a moment they didn't move. All day they had been using these hands for other people. Typing messages meant to reassure, holding space for stories that weren't theirs, offering advice they hoped would help, even when they weren't sure it would. They were good at it. People said so often enough. "You're so supportive. You always know what to say. I don't know what I'd do without you." Those words had once felt like praise. Lately, they felt more like a responsibility. They rubbed their hands together slowly, spreading the lotion over their skin. The scent was light, almost unnoticeable. The motion was familiar, automatic, something they'd done countless times without thinking. But tonight they noticed how careful they were being, how gentle. They moved the lotion into each finger, massaging the base of the thumb, the place that always ached first. The skin drank it in quickly, like it had been waiting. A thought passed through them, quiet and uncomfortable. When was the last time I treated myself this way? They had spent years learning how to respond to other people's pain, how to stay calm when emotions ran high, how to listen without interrupting. how to say the right thing without making it about themselves. Somewhere along the way, they had started doing the same thing to their own hurt, listening just enough to acknowledge it, then setting it aside, then moving on. They told themselves they were being strong, being practical, being generous. But standing there now, hands slick with lotion, they could feel the cost of that habit. The mirror reflected them back tired eyes, a face that still knew how to look composed, even when the inside felt thin. They met their own gaze briefly, then looked away, focusing instead on the simple task in front of them. They reached for a towel and dried their hands slowly. The cracks didn't sting as much anymore. The skin felt softer, more flexible. Not healed, but helped. They leaned back against the counter and let their shoulders drop. The release was small, but noticeable. Like setting down a bag they hadn't realized was digging into their arm. Throughout the day, they had been the one who listened, the one who checked in, the one who stayed steady when others couldn't. It felt good to be needed. It gave them a sense of purpose, of worth. But it also made it very easy to forget that need goes both ways. They picked up the lotion bottle again and turned it over in their hands. The label was smudged, the cap slightly crooked. It had been tossed into bags, dropped once or twice, used whenever someone else needed it. They realized then that they had been waiting for someone else to notice the cracks, waiting for someone else to offer care, waiting for someone else to say, "Hey, you don't have to hold everything alone." But tonight, no one was here to do that. And strangely, that didn't feel as lonely as it used to. They placed the bottle back on the counter and rested their palms flat against the cool surface. The contrast between the cold stone and their warmed skin made them pause. There was a quiet truth sitting just beneath the surface of the moment. Healing doesn't always come from being helped. Sometimes it comes from helping yourself in the exact way you've been offering to everyone else. They stayed there a little longer, breathing evenly, letting the idea settle without trying to shape it into a rule or a promise. The hands felt better now. Not perfect, but acknowledged. And for the first time that evening, that felt like enough. They turned off the bathroom light and let the room fall into shadow, leaving only the small nightlight glowing near the floor. The house felt different now, quieter, but not empty. More like it was holding space. They walked down the hallway slowly, noticing the way the floor felt cool under their feet. The sensation grounded them in their body in this moment instead of pulling them back into the day. In the bedroom, they sat on the edge of the bed and rested their hands in their lap. The skin felt softer now, more comfortable. The tightness had eased. It wasn't just the lotion. It was the attention. They thought about how often they had rushed past their own signals. The heaviness in the chest, the shallow breath, the way their jaw clenched when they said yes one too many times. Those signs had been there all along, quietly asking to be noticed. But noticing felt dangerous once. If they stopped to feel, would everything fall apart? If they admitted they were tired, would they still be useful? If they asked for help, would anyone show up? Those questions had shaped their habits more than they realized, so they became the one who didn't need much, the one who could handle it, the one who healed others. That role brought connection, appreciation, a sense of being indispensable. It also brought isolation, because the healer, they learned, often forgets how to receive. Lying back on the bed, they stared at the ceiling as the fan turned slowly above them. Each rotation was unhurried, consistent, unconcerned with outcome. The rhythm was calming in a way that didn't ask anything in return. They placed one hand over their chest. The gesture felt awkward at first, self-conscious, like they were pretending. But they kept it there, feeling the rise and fall beneath their palm, feeling the simple fact of being alive without needing to justify it. They had offered this kind of presence to others countless times, sitting quietly while someone cried, staying with them in uncertainty, not fixing, not rushing. What would it be like to offer that same patience inward? They didn't answer the question. They didn't need to. They just stayed. The ache in their chest softened slightly, not because it was solved, but because it was finally being held. There was a quiet relief in realizing that healing didn't have to arrive as a breakthrough. It could arrive as a habit, as a series of small private acts of care that no one else ever sees. A glass of water when the body is dry, a pause before saying yes, a hand on the chest instead of another explanation. These weren't grand solutions. They didn't make good stories. They didn't earn praise, but they worked. The person they had been waiting for all along, the one who would notice, who would respond, who would tend the wound with gentleness, had been here the whole time. Not as a rescuer, not as a hero, just as themselves. The room stayed quiet. The night deepened. Tomorrow they would likely slip back into familiar patterns. They would listen, support, care. That part of them wasn't wrong or broken. But tonight, something had shifted. They no longer believed that their worth came from being the one who held everything together. They no longer believed that neglecting themselves was the price of being needed. They were allowed to be both compassionate and cared for. As sleep approached, their breathing grew slower, deeper. The hand on their chest stayed there, warm and steady. The healer didn't disappear. They just learned how to turn the care inward, one small moment at a time. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.